Hello viewers, welcome to this Q&A. And in this video, I will try to answer some of your questions that you have asked. So let's start with the first question. It is about how a typical ancient Indian text is dated. So we have to first remember that it is quite rare that a particular ancient Indian text will tell us when it was authored. But I am not quite comfortable with the term a typical ancient Indian text, because when we are talking about ancient Indian text, we have variety of text. So for example, if we are restricting ourselves to texts that are about literature or literary texts, then we find that we have some text that we can date quite easily. So for example, the Charita texts, the main example of these type of literature is Harshcharit, Gaudavaho. So these texts we can easily date because these are the biographies of Indian monarchs. So if we are talking about Harshcharit, Harshcharit tells us the story of Harshvardhana. So because Harshvardhan is mentioned in this text and this text talks about the achievements of Harshvardhan, it is quite obvious that it was written during the time of Harshvardhan. Similarly, we can see Gaudavaho, which talks about Yashovarman of Kannauj. So these texts can easily we can date them easily. But something like, let's say, the works of Kalidas, then we have great problem. Because historians, what they use is, since Kalidas in his work does not clearly mention when the time of his existence, so what historians do is, first of all, they try to see in which Kalidasa's work he has mentioned some political developments. So based on these political developments, we can get a rough estimate of when this particular text was written. Alongside this, some scholars, what they do is they try to search text that we know the date of. So for example, there is a text A which was written in, let's say, 8th century AD or 7th century AD. And in this text, we have mention of Kalidas. So from this, it is quite reasonable to assume that Kalidas existed before 7th century AD. So that is how a relative dating is done. And because of this, we have great disagreements among scholars. And if you look at the academic literature on the dating of Kalidas, you will see how different views of different scholars are. So that is a rough idea. Based on a particular text, we can use different dating methods. So a typical ancient Indian text is not, I think, the right terminology here to use. You have to first understand that we have different ancient Indian texts, and depending upon what kind of ancient Indian text it is we are trying to date, our methodology changes. So this is my answer. Now let's move to the second question. So this is about why we see megalithic burials in southern India but not in northern India, or there is any connection between the megalithic burials of southern India and burials from Turkey or other western regions. So first of all, let's first understand what a megalithic structure is. So the best example and the most famous example is the Stonehenge, that is in UK. So Stonehenge, as you can see, is a huge stone structure, and that has not been worked upon. So there are no sculptures in this particular arrangement, and usually in megalithic structures we do not find any sculpted use of any sculpted stones. And in the Indian case, we find that majority of our megalithic burials are situated in southern India. Now the question is why we have only megalithic burials in southern India. The answer to this, in my view, has to do with the geography of the Indian subcontinent. If we are talking about, let's say, the northern Indian plains, you will not find any large loose stones from which we can make megalithic burials. But this is not the case in southern India. So I think if we are talking about megalithic burials, geography plays an important role, and that is what we see in southern megalithic burials. And about the connection between southern megalithic burials and outside, I don't find that there is any connection between these two. We have certain practices that are common between, or the approach of megalithic burial may be common in, let's say, Turkey or southern India, but that does not mean that there has to be some common origin. So that is what I would say on this. Now the next question is why the Mauryans did not conquer Northeast, and why the Mauryans could not conquer Tamil Nadu. Did this invasion failed? So to answer this, let's first focus on the first half. Why the Mauryans did not conquer Northeast. So let's first understand why any conquest happens. So there are, in my view, three reasons why any conquest happen. First is political reasons. A particular ruler wants to expand his realm. The second is the economic reason. There is a particular economic value of a particular region, and a king wants to occupy this region in order to gain wealth. The third is the religious reason. Something a king wants to do in order to in order to gain religious merit, that sort of thing. So we have three different reasons why conquest occurs. Now in the case of Northeast, we do not have any evidence that the Mauryans conquered land for religious reasons. But when it comes to economy and political reasons, we can say that at this time, Northeast was not politically developed. Politically developed in the sense that state formation had not happened in the northeastern region. Now, when we are talking about northeastern region, we have to understand, we have to first ask ourselves which particular region of the northeast we are talking about. So since we are talking about, let's say, the whole northeast, in most of the northeast, political state formation had not happened. So because of this, there was no impetus on the part of the Mauryans to conquer Northeast. So this is the first part. Now let's talk about the second part. Why the Mauryans failed to conquer Tamil Nadu, or was this invasion failed? So we have to first understand that we know about the realm of the Mauryas because of Ashoka's edicts. So what historians basically do is that they take the location of various Ashokan edicts and then they try to construct the Mauryan Empire. So if we go by this methodology, we have this map of Mauryan Empire, and in it we find that the extreme south of the Indian subcontinent is not under the Mauryan sway. This also is confirmed through Ashokan inscriptions, where Ashok mentions Cholas, Satiputras and Keralaputras. So because of this, it is quite reasonable to assume that this part of the Indian subcontinent was not conquered by the Mauryas. Now the question comes, did the Mauryas ever tried to conquer this region? We have some evidence of a Mauryan conquest from Sangam text, where the chariots of the Mauryas are mentioned. Now, the term Mauryas has been used in Sangam text. What historians do is that they speculate that this Maurya of the Sangam text are the Mauryans of our ancient Indian history. And from this, there are some scholars who argue that the Mauryans did try to invade the deep south, but they failed. In my view, we cannot speculate this because the evidence is not sufficient enough. So based on the current evidence, it is quite hard for us to say whether the Mauryas ever tried to conquer the deep south or not, or whether they just accepted that this was the maximum extent of the empire and they could not go beyond it. So this is my answer, but I will also tell you that I will soon do a video on this topic, and so you can watch that video to know more about what I think about this southern conquest of the Mauryas. Now the next question is video on Indian armors and why the bow lost its legendary status among Indian Kshatriyas or warriors and was entirely replaced by heavy emphasis on swords. First of all, about the videos on Indian armors, I will soon do a video on it, but right now I am collecting references in order to make a compelling video, so you have to wait for a while. Now about the next part of your question, that archery or bow and arrow was replaced by swords. I don't think that bow and arrow was entirely replaced, because if we are talking about, let's say, the Guptas, we find that in the coins of the Gupta emperors, they have shown bow quite a lot, which goes to show that the importance of bow and arrow had not diminished. And we have to also remember that even during the time of the Mauryas, we find that elephants had become an important part of ancient Indian warfare. And in this type of warfare, we find that mounted archers were placed on elephants, and they mounted elephants, and this provided a high shooting platform. So in this type of warfare, the importance of bow and arrow had not decreased. So I don't believe that the bow and arrow was entirely replaced by swords. Now the next question is about why the Satavahanas are considered post-Mauryan, when we know that Kharvel mentions Satakarni in his inscription. So first of all, we have to see which Satakarni is Kharvel talking about. Most scholars believe that Kharvel is talking about Satakarni first, who is the third ruler of the Satavahan dynasty. And so because of this, it is quite difficult for us to say that the Satavahanas were Mauryans or Pre-Mauryans. And even if we are talking about the date of Kharvel, there is quite a lot of disagreement. But in Kharvel's Hathigumpha inscription, he does talk about Yavanraj. And the fact that Yavanraj is mentioned leads us to believe that Kharvel existed most probably during the period after the Mauryas. And Kharvel also talk about King Bahasatamita, who is the king of Magadh and Ang. Now, who this Bahasatamita is, there is a great debate. If we are talking about the numismatic evidence, there are scholars who have studied coins that has the name Bhasitamita, and these coins are found in the region of Awadh and western UP. They argue that this Bhasatamita existed in the second half of 1st century AD. But there are other scholars who believe that this Bhasatamita is none other than Pushyamitra Shunga. So you can see the dating of Kharvel is there is no consensus about when Kharvel existed, but most scholars are of the opinion that Kharvel existed in the post-Mauryan period. So because of this, and even if you are talking about, let's say, the Kharvel is talking about Satakarni first, it is quite reasonable to assume that since Satakarni first is the third ruler of the Satvahana realm, we can assume that the Satavahanas also existed in the post-Mauryan period. And then you can do the analysis on what kind of Brahmi is used in the Naneghat inscription of Queen Naganika. So based on all of this, most scholars believe that Satavahanas existed in the Post-Mauryan period. Now let's move to the next question. Evidence of Pre-Mauryan Brahmi. So as of now, there is no historical consensus that we have any evidence of Pre-Mauryan Brahmi. There are some scholars who argue that the Tamil Brahmi alphabets that are found from potsherds in Anuradhapuram, that corresponds to Pre-Mauryan Brahmi. Then there are other scholars who have argued that the inscriptions of Sohagora and Mahasthan are evidence of Pre-Mauryan Brahmi. But in both the cases, particularly when we are talking about the potsherds that contain alphabet of Tamil Brahmi, the dating, there is a debate about how the dating is done, and there are many scholars who do not accept the kind of dating that is given to these potsherds. And when we are talking about the inscriptions of Sohagora and Mahasthan, there are scholars who have done analysis on what kind of Brahmi that is written in these inscriptions. So based on this analysis, they argue that this Brahmi is Post-Mauryan Brahmi. So as of now, we do not have any evidence of Pre-Mauryan Brahmi. Now let's move to the next question. My views on the series History and Culture of the Indian People. First of all, as you can see here, these are some of my books of this series. And I believe that this was one of the most monumental works of Indian history writing. The kind of detail and the depth that is mentioned in these series, in the books that are part of this series, is simply phenomenal. But what is also quite tragic about this series is that this series came into existence in the 1950s. And right now, the year is 2024. So in this 70 years or so, we have not been able to produce something comparable to this series, which I find quite tragic, because when we read the series, it is a remarkable work, and the kind of detail that is mentioned and the rigor that is put in these books is truly extraordinary. But the fact remains that these books were written in 1950s. So some of the arguments, some of the conclusions that are mentioned in this book has now been outdated. So we can talk about, for example, the Kushanas or the Huns. So the kind of information that you will read about the Kushanas, later Kushanas that came after Kanishk, or the Huns, these details are now outdated. But since nothing major, there are no revisions that were done to this series, we have outdated information. So that is there, but it is certainly a monumental work of Indian history writing. Now let's move to the next question. You say that majority of Indian texts are yet to be translated. Based on some recently translated documents among them, what contents do you expect to be found in them? Would it be just some Shastras, or can we hope for something new, interesting, groundbreaking? Also, what are the odds we can find more about the Indian social life? Are you at a point where you can read/translate these Sanskrit texts? Now let's start with your first part of the question. What is new, groundbreaking, or interesting for me may not be groundbreaking, interesting, or new for somebody else. So all of this is quite relative. But let's say we are talking about 100 manuscripts that have not been studied. I would argue that majority of it would be religious in nature. And we should also remember that most of the text that have survived up until now, whether it has been studied or whether it has not been studied, all of these are copies of original manuscripts. So the effort of copying a manuscript would mean that a particular text is part of a tradition, And right now, most of the tradition that has survived are religious traditions. So that is why I would argue that the majority of the manuscripts that have not been studied or that are untranslated would be of religious nature. Now, this does not mean that these religious texts may not have something groundbreaking or interesting. They can surely have that. So, we should not think of these religious texts as lacking in historical information. They are quite valuable for us. And about your second part, that what are the odds we can find more information about Indian social life. So whether a text belongs to religious category or whether it is a legal treatise or whether it is a text, let's say something like Arthashastra. All of these texts can provide us valuable information about the social life of a particular period as well. So, for example, if we are talking about, let's say, Harshcharit. Harshcharit is a biography of Harshvardhana, but it can also tell us about what kind of social life existed around the royal courts, Indian royal courts during this time. What was the religious life of this period? So all of these details we can get from whether we are talking about religious text or whether some other texts. Now about your third part, about my Sanskrit skills. As of now, I do not have this kind of Sanskrit skills, and it would take maybe 2 years of advanced Sanskrit training to tackle these Sanskrit texts. These are quite hard texts. And we have to first also remember that when we are talking about manuscripts, it just not it does not only mean that we have to have sufficient Sanskrit skills, but we should also have the sufficient skill to read what is written in the manuscript, because the kind of script that has been used is very different from the Devanagari which we are familiar with. And also, when we are talking about manuscript, it is quite different from edited work. So there are many texts which we have available in edited form, which means that we have modern printed copies of these manuscripts, and scholars have gone through these manuscripts and they have typed out what is written in a book form. But these works are not translated. So translating these works are relatively easy from first understanding the manuscript, then editing it, and then translating it. So the former is relatively easy, whereas the latter is quite hard. Now let's move to the next question. Did Sati Pratha prevail in Gupta period? Aran inscription. So first of all, let's look at this Aran stone pillar inscription which he is talking about. In this Aran stone pillar inscription, which is dated to the Gupta year 191, which would roughly mean 510 to 511 AD. So in this stone pillar inscription, we are told that there was a person called Goparaj, and he fought a famous battle in which he died, and after his death his wife committed sati. The word sati has not been used in this inscription. So the question is that from this particular evidence, can we say that sati pratha or the practice of sati was common in the Gupta period? My answer is no, because we have only one evidence, and in order to say that Sati Pratha prevailed in the Gupta period, you have to have solid evidence. Only one evidence does not mean that this type of practice prevailed in the Gupta period, because we have to remember that in order to say that a particular practice prevailed in a particular period, we have to have multiple evidence. But in the case of Sati practice, this kind of evidence we do not see in the Gupta period. We have only this inscription of of Aaron stone pillar inscription. But some of you who have read Harshcharit would argue that the wife of Prabhakar Vardhan or the mother of Harshvardhana, Yashomati, had committed Sati. So does this not mean that the practice of Sati was prevalent in ancient India? To which I would argue that not only Yashomati but even the sister of Harshvardhana, Rajyashri, she too was going into the funeral pyre when Harshvardhan had stopped her. So what does it tell us? It tells us that this practice was associated to the royal households or to the noble families. But to say that this was prevalent does not we do not have enough evidence, because when Harshvardhan stopped Rajyashri from going into the funeral pyre, it was not like after this act Rajyashri was shunned from the outside world. If we are talking about Huanzang mentions that the sister of Harshvardhan was beside him when Harshvardhan was talking to Xuanzang, which shows that this type of practice, the Sati practice, existed in ancient India, and it existed in the noble and the royal families. But when we are talking about, let's say, at the lower level, there is not much evidence to say that everyone in ancient India was performing this practice of Sati. Now let's move to the next question. Diet of kings and peasants in the Mauryan period. Now, if we are talking about peasants, I think their diet would heavily rely on grains. So if we are talking about, let's say, a peasant living in the region of Bihar or Eastern UP, their diet would heavily involve rice. And if we are talking about peasants from Haryana, Punjab, this region, their diet would include wheat or barley. And apart from this, we have to also remember that what we eat now, like potato, tomato, chilies, these type of ingredients were not available to peasant of Mauryan period, or even kings of the Mauryan period. And even in, let's say, in 16th century, these ingredients were not introduced into India. They were introduced when the Portuguese introduced them from the Americas. So this is about peasants. Now, when we talk about kings, we have an interesting detail from Ashokan edict. Because in one of his edicts, Ashok tells us that in the royal kitchen, deer was eaten, and along with deer, we have peacock, which is quite strange, because we would assume that a royal household would include deer. It is quite common, but peacock is something which we do not find easily, and in today's India, eating peacock is a taboo. So this is an interesting information about information that is quite credible, since it appears in Ashokan inscription, that what kind of meat was cooked in the royal court, royal kitchen of the Mauryas. Now let's move to the next question. Can you make a video on Sandrocottus and Alexander meeting? So if you watch my channel regularly, you will know that I have already made a video on Chandragupta Maurya and Alexander meeting each other. And my argument in that video was that this incident never happened. It is just made up by the Western historians who were writing at that time. So this was my argument in that video, and for detail you can watch that video. But on a general level, I have received many comments and questions regarding the fact that this Sandrocottus, or in some books the name is Sandrocottus. So this Sandrocottus or Sandrocottus of classical texts, Western classical text, is not really Chandragupta Maurya, but he is Chandragupta I, the third Gupta emperor. To this, I would argue that this is just a conspiracy theory, because we have so much evidence to prove that this Androcottus or Sandrocottus is Chandragupta Maurya, that this theory does not have any chance. So we can, for example, see the inscriptions of Ashoka. Now, if you look at Ashokan inscription, you will find that Ashoka has mentioned the Greek states that came after Alexander. So Ptolemaic, Seleucid, so these type of states are mentioned in Ashokan inscription. Now, if suppose this Androcottus or Sandrocottus is Chandragupta first, and Chandragupta first is meeting Alexander, then how can it be possible that that Ashoka is mentioning states that came after Alexander, but Chandragupta first, the Gupta emperor who came some let's say 500 years after Ashoka, he is meeting Alexander? So this does not, make any sense. Then we can analyze the inscription, the type of Brahmi that has been used in Ashokan inscription, and the kind of Brahmi that has been used in the coins of Chandragupta first. And when you analyze this, you will find that the Brahmi that has been used in Ashokan inscription is quite primitive relative to the Brahmi that has been used in the coins of Chandragupta first. Apart from this, we have to also explain what happened, the coming of the Shakas, Kushanas, Indo-Greeks, and how you will monkey balance these important historical details to argue that Chandragupta first is the Androcottus and Sandrocottus who met Alexander. So, and we have to also remember that before our period, before this time, there were great scholars who have already written great works on Mauryan history. So scholars like K.P. Jaiswal, R.C. Majumdar, H.C. Rai Chaudhary. And these scholars have not, found this obvious detail, but we in the 21st century have spotted this obvious mistake which other great scholars have forgotten. So there has to be some humility on our part to argue. First of all, you have to first understand that what those who argue who argue for such theories, what they do is they have a conclusion, and then they look for evidence to prove that conclusion. So this is what those who argue that Sandrocottus is Chandragupta first, that is what they are doing. Now let's move to the next question. Is Piyadasi the original name of Ashoka? And the name of Ashoka is a honorific Buddhist title. First of all, when you read the Ashokan inscription, you will find that most of the times Ashoka calls himself Devanam Piyadasi. If you read the early literature of scholars who were trying to decipher the Brahmi inscription, the inscriptions of Ashoka, they were quite perplexed by the fact that who this Devanam Piyadasi was, and there were multiple theories of who this Devanam Piyadasi was. But in 1950 in Karnataka, Raichur district, scholars found a minor edict of Ashoka, and in this minor edict it was written Devanam Sa Ashoka Sa. So from this entire debate that who this Devanam Piyadasi was became cleared. Now we had a solid evidence to say that this Devanam Piyadasi of these inscriptions was none other than Ashoka. And interestingly, this minor edict that was found from Raichur district, the exact location was Musky. So from Musky, this minor edict is the only edict of Ashok where Ashok calls himself Devanam Piyasa Ashok. In other edicts, the name Ashok never appears. So from this we can clearly see that Ashok was the name that has been used by Ashok himself. Then even after the Mauryan period, from Karnataka itself, this time in the Kalaburgi or Gulbarga district, we have an inscription on top of a sculpture from Kanaganahalli, where it is written Ranyo Ashok or King Ashok. So from these inscriptional evidence, it is quite obvious that Ashok was the name which was used for Ashok. It is not just a honorific title that the Buddhist text has used for Ashok. So I hope I was able to answer your question. Now let's move to the next question. If you had a time machine, which period of Indian history would you go to visit? Second, could you please make a video on the interaction that Antiochus III had with the Indian ruler Sophagasenus? Your channel is amazing. So thank you for your compliment. And first of all, let's look at your first question, like which period of Indian history I find quite fascinating. So if you are talking about, and since I am restricting myself to ancient history for this question, so I would argue that I would like to go to the period of 6th century BCE, or generally what we call the Mahajanpada period, because this was the period when we have small kingdoms from, let's say, from the borders of Afghanistan to the Indian plains, and there was this cultural fermentation that was going on, and we have great philosophies that were emerging. So this was a period of great great churning. So I would like to visit this period, the kind of cultural vibrancy and the political vibrancy that this period had, in my view, somewhat diminished in later times. So I would like to visit the Indian subcontinent of 6th century BCE. And about the second part of your question, who was this Sophagasenus and his interaction with the Seleucid ruler Antiochus III? So the information about Sophagasenus, we learn about Sophagasenus from Polybius. And Polybius tells us that when Antiochus III crossed the Hindu Kush, he met this Indian ruler, and interestingly, Polybius calls Sophagasenus the king of the Indians. And we are told that this Indian ruler gave Antiochus III some 150 elephants, and he also gave some treasure to Antiochus III. Now the question is who this Sophagasenus is. So, although in Polybius he is called the king of the Indians, most scholars believe that he was just a king of a small kingdom in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, and his Indian name, or his original name, was probably Sophagasenus. So this is what his scholars believe, and I would try to make a video on this topic, but the fact is, apart from these details, we do not have enough to really make a 10 to 15 minute long video. So I would try to see whether can I make a video about this topic or not. So now let's move to the next question. Is there any contemporary source that suggests Chanakya's existence? If we are talking about the exact meaning of contemporary, like the time when Chanakya existed, so the general view is that Chanakya existed during the time of Chandragupta Maurya and some early parts of Bindusar's reign. So that would be the period from 321 BCE to, let's say, 280 BC of sorts. So this is the rough period. So 320 BC to 280 BC. And during this period, we do not have any contemporary evidence of Chanakya's existence. But the problem is, if we are sticking to this definition of contemporary evidence, then we also do not have any contemporary evidence about the existence of Chandragupta Maurya or Bindusar, or if we are talking about the early Magadhan rulers like Bimbisar, Ajatashatru, Udayan, etc. These are also figures for whom we do not have any contemporary evidence. So this need, if we are in order to see whether there was any particular ruler, and we are only using contemporary evidence, then what you will find that many of important names from Indian history would just disappear. So this need for contemporary evidence, in my view, is not really something we can find, because if we are talking about the history before the Mauryas, we do not exactly have any contemporary evidence. So I hope I was able to answer your question. Now let's move to the next question. Hello, good sir. I am planning to do history honors from DU. I wanted to ask, what are some book recommendations you would like to give, be it on Indian history or historicism? Also, what are the certain pitfalls that a historian must avoid? So, congratulations for your future studies. Now, my book recommendation. So in the second Q&A, I have mentioned some books that you can read to gain a rough overview of entire Indian history. Now, about books related to historicism, I think it would be much better for you to read books on historiography, because that is what you will the emphasis will be on historiography in your history honors course in DU. So for that you can read this book, which I hope which is quite famous. So this is What is History of E.H. Carr. So this is recommended in the syllabus of history honors in DU. And apart from this, apart from reading E.H. Carr's What is History, you can also read a textbook of historiography by E. Sridharan. So, and these are two books, but there is also another book by R.G. Collingwood, The Idea of History. So these are the books that are related to historiography, and these books will tell you how this field of history writing evolved over time. So I think you have to know more. You have to know about historiography and how history writing evolved. And the third part of your question: what are some of the pitfalls a historian should avoid? So the answer to this question will also get solved when you read these books on historiography. So I hope I was able to answer your question. Now I'm really sorry for those of you whose questions I'm not able to answer. But you have to remember that we have some limited time for this Q&A. And I will regularly do this Q&A once in a month or two, so that most of my audience can ask me questions, and I hopefully would able to answer your question. So thanks for watching, and if you like this video, you can watch my previous Q&A here. And thank you, and please subscribe this channel.